Good evening. Tonight we begin with something a little colder than a whispered fairy tale. The terrifying history of rabies, the disease that has stalked both animals and humans across continents and centuries. Forget the cinematic scares and comforting legends. Rabies was never a tidy monster in a storybook. It was brutal, bewildering, and left communities scrambling for explanations and desperate remedies. The truth is, if you were bitten, in much of human history your chances were grim. Survival was far from guaranteed, and the slow collapse into fever, confusion and fear was an all-too-real possibility. Before you get too comfortable, give the video a like and subscribe if you're enjoying it. Let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is on your end. It's incredible to see viewers joining in from every corner of the world. Now, dim the lights, and let's step into tonight's journey together. In the clay brick streets of Uruk and Babylon, the world smelled of bread and river mud and animal urine. And among those smells moved dogs, mongrels, hunting hounds, temple animals tethered to the service of healing goddesses, sometimes placid, sometimes wild. The earliest witnesses to what we now call rabies were not scientists with microscopes, but scribes carving complaints and laws into wet clay, priests muttering incantations in shrines, and householders tallying losses. Cuneiform tablets from Mesopotamia, stretching back into the second millennium before our era, preserve dry records of liability and loss, an owner liable if his dog kills, a fine to be paid if a beast harms a neighbour, instructions for what to do when a man or beast falls ill after a bite. Those legal traces are quiet, bureaucratic things, but they speak plainly of a problem that demanded public management long before the word epidemic had settled into human speech. The gods, as always, were in the frame. Ninisina and Gula, Mesopotamian goddesses of healing, whose iconography and rites were associated with dogs, became entangled in the human attempt to name, to propitiate, and to treat the calamity of a bite that led to madness. Across the eastern Mediterranean, the Nile Delta offered its own ledger. Egyptian medical papyri, most famously the Ebers papyrus dated around 1550 BCE, contain recipes and incantations addressed to bite wounds and to a kind of madness that set the jaws and the limbs against their owner. The sun-beaten physicians of Thebes and Memphis mixed poultices of herbs with prayers, recommending oils, cauteries and spells. When a dog bit, one remedy might insist on practical cleanliness and the salting of wounds. Another might insist on an invocation to the deities who governed health and fate. Artifacts from Egyptian temple precincts showed dogs associated with healing. Votive figures of canines were left by supplicants, an offering in return for survival. There was observation here, wounds that festered, men who changed after a bite. But it was braided intimately with ritual. The explanation did not have to be exclusive. A bite could be a wound, a curse, and a test of piety all at once. If we listen to the slow music of Greek language, we hear the old word Lyssa, a name with a taste of bile in it. Lyssa was not only a symptom but a personification. In Homer and in later poets, the madness that seizes a beast or a man is sent by a god and often called by that same name. Lyssa drives the hound to foam, the man to murderous frenzy. In Euripides, the goddess Lyssa is a hand at the work of divine retribution, a force that can lay low even heroes. The Greeks observed, with a mixture of poetry and scrutiny, what a man bitten by a mad dog would become. Unsteady speech, aversion to water, convulsive spasms, features that would, millennia later, be recognized as hallmarks of the disease caused by a certain Lyssa virus. Hippocratic and other medical writers, operating in the idiom of humours, recorded clusters of such symptoms and sometimes advised practical measures, scraping the wound, cauterizing, trying to draw out the poison, while still recounting mythic causation. Aristotle, who catalogued animals with a proto-taxonomist's curiosity, noted behavioural oddities among biting creatures. Observation was making a slow, tentative alliance with superstition. The two were neither equals nor enemies, but cousins at table. Rome, that enormous organism of roads and laws and legionary discipline, found itself obliged to manage the same odd problem. Pliny the Elder, in his natural history written during the 1st century CE, was both encyclopedist and alarmist. He recorded anecdotes of mad dogs, and of men who, after being bitten, showed fear of water and an inexorable slide into convulsive delirium. Roman surgeons and medical authors, Celsus and later Galen, took up the subject with the tools they had: cautery irons, cups for bloodletting, the Galenic theory that disease was an imbalance of complex humours and animal spirits. Galen, writing in the 2nd century, proposed mechanisms that tried to pin the problem into a physiological framework familiar to his contemporaries. Disease might travel, he argued in his own terms, along the nerves to the heart of the mind. Practical responses emerged alongside legal notions of responsibility. Municipal authorities in the empire occasionally issued edicts to control dangerous animals, and householders were sometimes obliged to curtail their dogs lest they become the start of social unrest. The remedy list, poultices, cauteries, amputation in extremis, grew long and pragmatic, but the edge of superstition remained as sharp as ever. A mad dog might be seen as a vessel of divine wrath or witchery, and men bitten were sometimes thought to be marked by fate. There has always been something attractively monstrous about the human impulse to explain the unexplainable by imagining the supernatural. The symptoms of rabies, the sudden aggression that turns a usually social animal into a biting machine, teeth locked on flesh, the foaming at the mouth, the strangling fear of water when the throat convulses and attempts to swallow, read easily into the archetypes of the werewolf and the vampire. Ovid's Metamorphoses tells the old story of Lycaon, transformed into a wolf and condemned to hunger for companionship in a skin that will not forgive him. That Roman poem sits like a fossil in the medieval ground. It has been reanimated again and again. In rural Europe, where communities kept close counsel and the night had a long reach, savage attacks by dogs or wolves were sometimes explained by a human being changed by witchcraft or malediction. The werewolf, the community imagined, might not be an animal at all, but a neighbour hiding a gnawing hunger under a familiar face. When children vanished or the livestock was found torn, the suspicion could fasten on a person next door who'd been behaving oddly. The same array of behaviours that could result from mental illness, from epilepsy, or indeed from infection, could be read through a cultural lens that expected the supernatural. The earliest modern werewolf trials, which flare in our records in the 16th and 17th centuries, show how these readings could turn juridical. In the region of Dole in Franche-Comté in 1573, a man named Gilles Garnier was accused, tried and executed for being a werewolf after a string of attacks on children. His confession, extorted, unreliable, soaked in the language of possession, was recorded by local authorities. In Germany, around the same era, the case of Peter Stump, often dated to 1589 in Bedburg, reads like the darkest of folklore given court form. Testimony about nightly transformations, pâtés made from children's flesh, and a government keen to dramatise moral lessons. Whether any of these accused were actually sick with rabies is unknowable. What is clear is that the imagery of biting and blood and the social panic attached to it overlapped with popular understandings of the disease. The result was a strange double violence, against animals believed to be vectors, and against humans believed to be carriers of a moral contagion. Further east, where the Slavic world held different patterns of folk belief, the figure of the vampire began to form from motifs that can be read, with some plausibility, as responses to the same fears. Corpses exhumed in the 18th century in parts of what is today Serbia and Croatia were sometimes found with fresh-appearing blood at the mouth or with limbs not yet collapsed, and frightened villagers struggling with unfamiliar processes of decomposition concluded that the dead had risen to feed. Under the Habsburgs, these reports reached official ears, and, in a flourish of bureaucratic and medical anxiety, imperial officials ordered autopsies and produced dossiers on the vampire problem in the 1720s and 1730s. Those dossiers, which circulated in translation through coffee houses and London print, did something important. They carried the vampiric image into Western European imagination and convinced a reading public that there existed an undead predator in the villages of the Balkans. If you had never seen a throat spasm and therefore could not recognise the signs of rabies, the vampire's piercing teeth and nocturnal predations fit the fear neatly. Popular tales absorbed and amplified the idea, the undead as a reason for nightly terrors. The biting reimagined as both literal and moral contagion. By the time the 18th and 19th centuries turned the European mind more often toward laboratory instruments and less toward exorcists, literature had already made itself comfortable with the imagery. John Polidori's The Vampire, first published in 1819, and Bram Stoker's Dracula at the end of the century, consolidated a set of motifs: aristocratic predators, the corrupting bite, the night that becomes a law unto itself, that can be traced, at least in part, to the folk and medico-legal anxieties about biting and blood. These stories are not medical manuals, but they translate clinical terror into cultural dread. Their popularity mattered, because myths travel faster than treaties and sometimes harder. A rumour about a dog with foaming mouth will move a village to stone an animal, or lynch a stranger far faster than any physician can write a prescription. If the mythic and the literary-fed public panic medicine, slow, fumbling, human, kept trying to lace observation to theory. The classical humoralists saw rabies as a manifestation of an imbalance: heat, dryness, and corrupted juices producing a kind of internal fire that made the sufferer foam and rage. The cures proposed were consistent with a medical logic that would last a millennium. Bloodletting sought to remove excess. Cauterization tried to seal and purify. The ancient surgeon's iron was as literal a firewall as he could muster. There was also, however, a current of empirical thinking that noticed something very practical. The bite was the starting point. Even in antiquity, physicians observed the regularity with which a bite preceded madness, and practical guides insisted upon washing wounds, binding them with herbs, and sometimes excising tissue. The moral and the mechanical coexisted in uneasy germination. As the Roman world dissolved and medieval Christendom took shape, explanations multiplied. Disease might be divine punishment, demonic assault, or medical misfortune. It might also be contagion, in a sense not yet articulated in germ theory. Monks and physicians in the Byzantine world and in the Islamic Empire continue to write on the subject. Paul of Aegina in the 7th century gathered surgical knowledge that included counsel on bites. Arabic physicians such as Al-Razi, known in the West as Rabies, d. 925, and Ibn Sina, known as Avicenna, 980 to 937, treated bite wounds in the context of an elaborate medical corpus. Avicenna's canon of medicine and Al-Razi's clinical writings offered reasoned descriptions of the progression from bite to fever to nervous disturbance. They recommended cautery and other pragmatic interventions, and their texts would be read for centuries in university medical schools from Cordoba to Montpellier. The physicians of Islam, working in cities where animal encounters were frequent and where hospitals had pharmaceutical stores and libraries, made crucial contributions. They were rigorous observers, and sometimes they favoured expelling putrid matter from wounds as the chief therapy. Yet alongside their practical measures stood charm and prayer, which often accompanied a medicinal ointment. The coexistence of the spiritual and the surgical was not merely superstition, it was a social strategy in communities where healing required the cooperation of temple, household, and hospital. The medieval period also reveals in stark relief the dangerous logic that can grow out of incomplete knowledge. When bite wounds were thought to transmit a miasma or an evil essence, desperate measures followed. Amputation of the bitten limb was sometimes proposed as a radical prevention. If the animal's poison could be removed with the limb, perhaps the mind could be spared. There are recorded instances in both medieval and early modern surgical manuals of tongues and fingers being lopped or of cauterization performed so savagely that few would survive the trauma. Burning was common too. Animals accused of carrying the disease could be slaughtered and burned in public to reassure a village, and to create the obscene moral clarity of ash and smoke. The spectacle mattered. It provided a visible closure to communal fear. At the cusp of the Renaissance, European surgeons like Ambroise Paré, through 1510 to 1590, who had himself served on French battlefields and written with bracing common sense, began to push back against some of the worst abuses. Paré criticised boiling oil as a primary treatment for wounds and advocated gentler dressings when they worked. He wrote about animal bites and favoured careful debridement and less brutal cauterization when it could be avoided. Yet even Paré and his contemporaries worked within a conceptual framework that had not yet disentangled the invisible agents that cause disease from the visible signs. The early modern period produced more systematic clinical observation. Physicians kept notebooks, surgeons recorded cases, and city officials documented the spread of fearful things. In 1546, Girolamo Fracastoro of Verona, writing in his De Contagione, proposed that disease could be spread by seeds, seminaria, which moved from person to person or via objects, an idea that would slowly fertilize the soil in which germ theory might later grow. Fracastoro's idea was protean and tentative, but it moved thinking away from pure imputation of sin toward a mechanism that could be tested. Yet centuries of error had also given rise to cultural procedures that were stubbornly resilient. Charms and folk cures persisted into the 19th century and sometimes beyond. Across Europe and the Ottoman lands, folk healers recommended salves made from herbs crushed with bread. In some places, the hair of the offending dog was taken and burned or buried in a prescribed way. In others, the patient was given potions or told to swallow bits of the animal that had bit them as a sympathetic cure. There is a tint of the grotesque in many of these remedies, and a kind of humility, an unscientific recourse to similarity and ritual when the world refused to be sensible. These cures had symbolic power. To consume something of the predator was to claim control, to domesticate the danger. They had, though, little to recommend them statistically. Religious ritual continued to play a role in healing and in hysteria. Priests and exorcists were often called to aid those who convulsed, and saints' shrines could become places of pilgrimage for those bitten. The medieval and early modern church could be both cruel and consoling. It presided over public executions of accused werewolves and conjured saints to intercede for the ill. At the same time, municipal authorities, municipalities with watchmen and bylaws, sometimes found themselves taking the most tactically effective measures they had, removing strays, impounding dogs, and issuing ordinances that made owners more accountable. The scope of response became a matter of governance as much as medicine. Not all physicians accepted the spiritual explanations. There were skeptics who insisted on the primacy of natural causes, who drew careful case histories and who sometimes laid out the first faint maps of transmission. The great Enlightenment philosophers and physicians, cautious and empiricist, nudged the conversation toward measurable description. In the British Isles, moving through the 17th and 18th centuries, physicians like Robert Witt took an interest in disorders of the nerves and attempted to separate hysteria from organic pathology. While he wrote primarily on nervous disorders, the climate of inquiry he participated in was one that demanded evidence. The great bold steps that would come in the 19th century, Pasteur and beyond, still lay ahead, but by then the medical profession had accumulated a mountain of messy case reports, surgical techniques and legal responses. Hospitals had organised casebooks, surgeons had accumulated instruments, municipalities had routines for dogs. This was not the slow accidental organisation of an epidemic, but the deliberate building of a societal response to a stubborn recurrent peril. There are small ironies in this long human history of fear and remedy. The same societies that prayed for miracles also catalogued symptoms. The same rulers who burned animals also legislated for animal control. The use of blunt instruments, irons, knives, fire, was sometimes the only technology available, and it offered, at the level of perception, a kind of victory. There is a darker irony. Many of the responses made sense if one believed that a visible locus of poison could be excised. That logic made visceral sense and occasionally saved lives through the limited means of wound hygiene or simple debridement, but more often it produced tragedy, disfigurement, infection, and the social shaming of victims who had done nothing but live. Through the centuries, what had at first been merely observation, someone bitten, someone else going mad, had been interpreted again and again within the prevailing worldview. In Mesopotamia, the connection was woven into legal obligations and temple supplications. In Egypt, it was folded into medical papyrus and the magico-religious therapy of the temple physician. In Greece and Rome, it became an object of philosophical and medical reflection. In medieval Islam and Christendom, it passed through physicians who wrote with surprising clarity, and through ritual experts who wrote with comforting and terrifying certainty. Folklore took clinical symptoms and transmuted them into creatures that would haunt the imagination. Werewolves at the edge of the forest, vampires in the grave. That folklore, in turn, fed legality and medicine. Courts used mythic frames to explain cruelty, and physicians used empirical practice to try and stem fear. And trickling like soft rain was the realization that the bite mattered, in ways more tangible than moral culpability. The wound was the beginning of a chain, and while ancient theories varied, from humoral corruption to demonic invasion to tiny invisible seeds, the practical insistence upon washing, excising, cauterizing and sometimes amputating reveals an intuitive grasp of transmission. Humanity reached viciously, sometimes embarrassingly, for remedies. It also organized laws, municipal bylaw, or temple rituals and surgical guilds became part of the infrastructure of response. When we look back, we can see how strategy, logistics and scale mattered more than heroics, how a city's decision to impound strays, a temple's habit of leaving votive dogs, a surgeon's preference for ligature over torch, a municipal ledger noting fines for canine attacks. All these small administrative and technical acts accumulated into a civilization's posture toward a terrifying threat. There was hysteria, certainly, and cruelty. There was also method, sometimes clumsy and sometimes revealing. The interplay between empirical observation and superstition did not resolve in a tidy drift from darkness into light. It was a long, uneven negotiation. By the time the world's laboratories and public health systems began to transform the approach to rabies in the modern era, the historical record contained mosaics of human response, legal codes that tried to deter negligence, mythic stories that gave shape to fear, medical treatises that recommended both prayer and cautery, and public spectacle that burned both animals and reputations. In bed at night, when the mind grows thin and the road outside is only moon and shadow, these stories of bite and law, of prayer and iron, of superstition and the first hesitant observations remain of a piece. The fear was ancient and the remedies were a patchwork, and through that patchwork one sees most strikingly the human desire to name the nameless, to bind the wildness with words and instruments and ritual. The disease provoked violence, but it also provoked institutions, courts, hospitals, treatises, public orders. Those institutions would, in later centuries, be the scaffolding for a scientific solution. For now, they reveal how communities chose to live with dread, and how they turned their limited tools toward the problem with the same stubborn resolve with which they fashioned bricks and baked bread. In the end, the history that passes from clay tablets and papyri through classical treatises, through folk tales of lupine men and blood-steeped corpses, and into the surgical logs of Renaissance barber surgeons, is a history of human meaning-making. It shows us the ways people marshal law, ritual, surgery, and story to defend themselves from something that moves quickly and unpredictably. A virus that turns familiar beings into threats. The ancients mixed observation with prayer because they had to. The medievals mixed cautery with exorcism because they did not yet know enough. The early moderns refined the tools and the language even as myth kept pressing at the borders of science. When dogs foamed at the mouth on the streets of Babylon or in the lanes of Thebes, when villagers in the Balkans exhumed a corpse and recoiled at the sight of what they believed to be feeding marks, when a Roman physician cauterized a wound while a priest lit a candle, the same human question hovered above them all: how to keep the biters from biting, and how to keep the bitten from being lost. Cities have always had to make a decision about the animals that shared their streets, their alleys, their marketplaces and their fears, and nowhere was that decision harsher than where rabies came near. Long before microscopes and laboratories could name an enemy, towns and communes wrote the disease into law, not as a medical problem alone, but as a civic one, a threat to order, commerce, and the neat geometry of urban life. In the narrow lanes of medieval Italy, the cobbles knew the scrape of muzzles and the creak of carts carrying bodies. In the timbered boroughs of England, the cry of the dog catcher mingled with the bell of the parish. Municipal ordinances, many of them pragmatic, some draconian, grew up wherever people lived close to animals, and the lesson quickly hardened into custom. If a dog acted strangely, it was not merely an infected creature, it was an insult to the city's authority, and to the fragile peace that made markets hum and guilds prosper. From Florence to Lubeck, medieval communes kept registers. They fined owners and sometimes ordered the killing of strays. Town charters and statutes, drafted by burghers who feared for their children and their trade routes, often contained clauses that would strike a modern reader as both sensible and cruel. Dogs had to be kept or otherwise impounded. Those that wandered or showed unprovoked aggression might be trapped and destroyed. A bite could trigger an inquiry not only by a surgeon but by a town council. In the absence of rapid medical knowledge, the legal apparatus stood in for diagnosis, and it was merciless. The rationale was both sanitary and symbolically performative, to show that law held dominion over the unruly animal world as well as over human miscreants. Wolves and stray dogs were slaughtered not only because they could harm, but because their public death comforted a populace that needed to see danger felled. Those patterns hardened in early modern Europe. As cities grew, as port towns throbbed with commerce, and as nation-states began to think in centralised terms about safety, the machinery of civic control matured. Paris in the 18th and 19th centuries kept registers of stray dogs. Municipal dog catchers were paid to sweep the arrondissements and bring back animals for inspection. London, during the same centuries of rapid urban expansion, employed officers to seize loose dogs and impose fines on cowardly owners. These were not merely ad hoc measures, they were elements of a nascent public health bureaucratic imaginary. Governors saw in a muzzled dog a city made legible and governable. The muzzles themselves became emblems, leather and wire, that said, in effect, "We will not allow the wild to invade the market." The language of legislation often made an uneasy but telling alliance between public health and social discipline. Muzzling ordinances told a deeper story than the control of bites. They told the poor that their animals, and therefore their liberty, were conditional on compliance. They told minorities and transient workers that their dogs could be seized and destroyed without much ceremony. When authorities sanctioned the systematic killing of feral animals, they were also, in many places, sanctioning broader hierarchies. The dog catcher had a surprising amount of power. The statistical register of dead animals became an instrument of municipal authority, and controlling animals was a first step toward policing the bodies of the city's most vulnerable inhabitants. Fear translated into policy in sharper ways when panic seized a population. Mad dog campaigns in the 19th century read like military mobilizations, proclamations issued from town halls, appointed officers given the right to enter gardens and cellars, and bounties posted on the heads of animals. In the Austrian Ardenne and German lands, outbreaks of canine rabies in the early 1800s prompted coordinated municipal drives. Strays were rounded up with nets, and entire litters were sometimes killed to remove threat. Similar scenes unfolded in colonial cities, where European administrators faced unfamiliar ecologies, and the anxiety of disease became bound up with the anxieties of empire. In British India, for instance, the sight of packs of dogs running the bazaars could spark telegrams to the colonial secretariat. Orders followed, and with them the complicated politics of whose property would be taken and whose animal lives would be regarded as dispensable. The culling of dogs was inexpensive to a colonial treasury, and it had the virtue of being visible, immediate, and politically unambiguous. Colonial-era import restrictions became another axis of civic control when the fear of rabies reached across oceans. Some of the most consequential decisions were made by colonies that lacked rabies altogether, and were determined to keep it so. Australia and New Zealand, island worlds with economies dependent on livestock and trade, adopted stringent quarantines in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Australia's Quarantine Act of 1908, for example, formalised powers that had long been exercised. Ports could refuse entry to animals, ships were subject to inspection, and strict rules were set for the importation of dogs and other potentially infectious creatures. The politics behind these laws were as much about preserving export markets and settler confidence as about preventing a zoonosis. The colonists framed rabies as a threat to their agricultural future and to the delicate social order that sustained settler life. New Zealand, which has since remained rabies-free, constructed a similar bulwark of regulations and customs controls, making the transport of companion animals an expensive and elaborate business. The leash in practice became an entry permit. The logistic machinery required to enforce these policies was large and sometimes ugly. Culling at scale meant funding for dog pounds, paying men to bait and trap, and establishing disposal systems. Quarantine required boarding facilities, veterinary officers, and protocols for inspection and certification, a whole small architecture of control. Municipal budgets shifted to meet the need. Municipal administrators recalibrated priorities. In some towns, money diverted from street paving went to the construction of kennels and to the salaries of the men who would patrol at night with torches. In other instances, governments experimented with bounties as cheap ways to reduce numbers. Citizens were encouraged with coin to turn in animals, dead or alive, and a market in such bounty hunting emerged, sometimes producing fraudulent claims and sometimes violent overreach. The efficiency of markets and the bluntness of public policy combined, and the street-level arithmetic of disease control became a moral arithmetic as well. Whose animal was worth saving, and who would pay? Ethical tensions followed closely. The culling of strays, while often justified as necessary, raised questions about stewardship and the responsibilities of owners. Who in a city was responsible for an animal's actions when owners were poor, transient, or absent? The laws that tried to make owners accountable sometimes ended up criminalising poverty. Fines for loose dogs could bankrupt a labourer, and their inability to pay could lead to the seizure of an animal, the imposition of a new social cost. And then there was the method of enforcement itself. Entering a private yard to seize a dog could mean breaking down a gate. Killing an animal could be performed publicly as a spectacle meant to reassure. But spectacle and reassurance did not erase grief. Pet keeping even then carried emotional weight, and municipal aggression could be experienced as an attack on personal life and dignity. These dissonances, between the public good of disease control and the private pain of loss, made rabies policy a site where modern governance, with all its purported rationality, exposed the raw edges of power. Beyond cities, the legal armoury took on national dimensions. As nation-states modernised in the 19th century, they built regulatory frameworks that connected municipal ordinances with national quarantine imperatives and with emergent veterinary services. Hungary and Russia, confronting rural outbreaks, set up regulations for reporting and slaughter, and by the late 19th century many European states were developing systems for reporting animal disease that resembled public health surveillance. Case definitions, logs, telegram lines linking rural clinics to provincial capitals. Epidemiology, at this stage, was as much administrative as it was scientific. The state wanted numbers to show that control was occurring. The data could be used both to justify further financial allocations and to signal competence to trading partners who feared that an outbreak in one region could close markets elsewhere. The pattern broadened in the New World. In the United States, the wave of urbanization and a series of high-profile rabies scares around the turn of the 20th century led municipalities from Boston to New Orleans to tighten leash laws, to insist on muzzles in public, and to authorize the immediate destruction of animals judged dangerous. The moral logic echoed Europe's. But American civic culture added a distinctive note. Community associations and humane societies became engaged in the debate, urging measures that combined control with charity. The anti-rabies campaigns were simultaneously campaigns of hygiene and civic improvement. In some cities, humane societies pushed for the capture and sheltering of animals rather than summary execution. They raised money for pounds, for veterinary care, and, crucially, for public education. The idea that a muzzled dog could be a rescued dog, trained, cleaned, and rehomed, tempered the teeth of harsher measures. Yet the balance was precarious. Tragedy or panic could tilt a policy from compassion to consignation overnight. The economic implications of these policies were practical and deep. The costs of culling, of maintaining quarantine facilities, of employing catch and kill breeders, and of financing veterinary inspection could be considerable. Small towns had to choose between road repair and a dog pound. Colonies chose between building a new quarantine shed at the port or paying a magistrate's salary. Private markets also changed. Hides from stray dogs were often sold. Informal industries cropped up, turning the animal body into commodities. The presence of bounties created perverse incentives. The easy money of a dog pelt undermined public trust and sometimes even encouraged the movement of animals toward bounty-collecting zones. Conversely, the availability of an effective vaccine, later in the 19th century, would create a new market and a new set of calculations. Vaccination meant cost, but it also promised to avoid larger losses. Thus, economics became both cause and cure in the politics of rabies control. And always, threaded through these administrative and economic calculations, was a moral question. How to balance the right of the community to be protected against the rights of individuals, human and an animal, within it. Rabies policy from the Middle Ages into the modern era thus becomes a study in governance as much as a study in disease. The leash, the muzzle, the pound, the quarantine gate, these are all the instruments of discipline, and they carry with them the echoes of other decisions the state might take, who to contain, who to exclude, who to cull for the greater good. The story of mad dog laws is a story about the birth of public health, as a force that is, even at its most rational, political. If municipal power wrestled with rabies on the streets and in the docks, the 19th century also saw the problem migrate from the square to the laboratory. The slow but relentless triumph of germ theory, Louis Pasteur's experiments on fermentation and disease, Robert Koch's development of postulates and his identification of the tubercle bacillus in 1882, reframed rabies from a fearsome affliction into a researchable phenomenon. For the first time, physicians and scientists dared to treat rabies as an object of experimental medicine rather than a manifestation of divine wrath or mysterious animal fury. This was not simple disenchanted science. It was a transformation of method, of instruments, and of imagination. The laboratories where rabies was unmasked were often modest rooms with wooden benches and drying racks, not the antiseptic spaces we imagine today. Scientists worked with animal nervous tissue, with the saliva of frightened dogs, with rabbits and dog sacrifice for the sake of knowledge. They measured incubation periods, recorded the progression of symptoms, and kept meticulous notebooks. The work was grisly in practical terms, but empirically exacting. The goal was to understand the mechanics. How did the disease move from a bite to the brain? Where did it lurk in the animal body? Could it be passed from one creature to another reliably in experiments? And if so, by what medium? A series of carefully documented experiments in the latter half of the 19th century established that rabies behaved like an infectious disease that could be transmitted by material derived from infected animals. Veterinarians and physiologists showed, in a range of settings from French provincial laboratories to German institutes, that inoculation with saliva or neural tissue from a rabid animal could reproduce the disease in a healthy one. The implication was electric. Rabies was not a random curse. It was transmissible and therefore in principle controllable. That conclusion collided with earlier ideas that privileged miasma or private vice, aligning rabies instead with the new age of microbes and contagion. Within this laboratory context, certain observations became touchstones. The neurotropism of the agent, its marked preference for nervous tissue, gradually became clear through repeated passages. Scientists watched infections ascend peripheral nerves to the spinal cord and then to the brain, a pathway that explained the delay between bite and furious symptomatology. They noticed, too, that the agent was present in saliva at particular stages, which helped explain how the disease was transmitted in ordinary life. These were slow accruals of knowledge, won through patience and repetition, the counting of days until paralysis, the charting of fever, the noting of the precise behaviours of a dog before it died. Each experiment was an attempt to render the invisible visible. A landmark of diagnostic pathology arrived in the early years of the 20th century when an Italian pathologist, Adelchi Negri, described distinct intracytoplasmic inclusions in the neurons of animals that had died of rabies. First reported in 1903, these Negri bodies, small rounded inclusions in Purkinje cells of the cerebellum and in hippocampal neurons, became for decades a pathognomonic marker for rabies infection. They were microscopic signatures. Find a Negri body in the brain and you had, in the era before molecular tests, a strong indication that rabies was present. For pathologists across Europe and America, the discovery created a practical diagnostic test for a disease that otherwise left few reliable ante-mortem signs. It brought a grim kind of aesthetic to the post-mortem table. The tiny pale pearling of infected neurons under a microscope. The identity of the agent itself remained controversial for a time. Some investigators suggested it was a toxin. Others argued for a living organism. The dawn of virology, itself made possible by the increasing use of filters that could separate bacteria from smaller entities, shifted thinking decisively. By the early 20th century, rabies was incorporated into the category of filterable, and therefore viral, agents. This was a conceptual leap. The term virus moved from its older usage, meaning poison, into a modern sense as a submicroscopic infectious particle. The acceptance of rabies as viral placed it within the same family of problems as the tobacco mosaic virus and, later, as influenza. It rendered the disease comprehensible to a new suite of laboratory methods. That classification was refined over decades. By mid-20th century, virologists would show the rabies agent's shape under electron microscope, a characteristic bullet-like virion, and genetic studies in the later 20th century would place it conclusively within the genus Lyssavirus of the family Rhabdoviridae. Those taxonomic moves came long after the first laboratory triumphs, but they completed a journey as that began with the pragmatic experiments of the 19th century: observation, transmission studies, pathology, and finally molecular identification. Once taxonomy caught up, rabies could be mapped on phylogenetic trees compared to related viruses and situated within the broader ecology of viral disease. There were dissenters and controversies along the way. Some scientists resisted the notion of a single causative agent, pointing to the diversity of symptoms and the multiplicity of vectors. Others objected to some of the methods used in experimentation, in particular to serial passage in animals, and to the sacrifice of large numbers of rabbits, a practice that, even then, drew criticism from emerging animal welfare advocates. But the dominant current of research, particularly in laboratories influenced by Pasteurism and Koechism, pushed relentlessly toward a model in which experimental repetition and controlled infection would reveal the structure of disease. That experimental ethic had moral costs: the death of animals, the use of vulnerable human subjects in early trials, and those costs would fuel later debates about scientific responsibility and the limits of intervention. Into that contentious laboratory theatre stepped Louis Pasteur with a proposal that would change the world's relationship to rabies, and in doing so, remake the expectations placed upon science. Pasteur, whose work on fermentation and on anthrax had already made him a household name in France and beyond, turned his attention in the 1880s to rabies, not because he was a clinician, but because he was a man of method seeking a problem he could solve with experimental manipulation. The key insight, or gambit, was to use the agent's dependence on neural tissue and to exploit a principle of attenuation. Weaken the pathogen so that it would induce immunity without causing fatal disease. The mechanism was simple in outline and grisly in detail. Pasteur and his collaborators infected rabbits with rabies, extracted the spinal cords, and then let them dry. Desiccation, they found, reduced virulence. A cord left to dry for a set number of days might no longer kill, but could still prime an immune response when introduced into a healthy animal. By graduating the degree of dryness, and thus the virus's strength, they constructed a stepped series of preparations that could be administered sequentially, each one slightly more virulent than the last, until the recipient's immune system was said to be armed against the natural deadly strain. It was a crude form of attenuation by passage and by physical treatment, and it worked in experimental animals. The rest was the test of nerve and of ethics. In July 1885, Pasteur performed what has become one of the great dramas of medical history. A 9-year-old Alsatian boy, Joseph Meister, had been savagely bitten by a dog alleged to be rabid. His family, terrified, brought him to Pasteur's laboratory at 9 Rue d'Ulm, and the scientist, who was not a medical doctor, faced a choice. To do nothing was to consign the child, should rabies take hold, to certain death. To act was to place an untried approach upon a human being. Pasteur, assisted by physicians such as Dr. Joseph Grancher and Émile Roux, administered a course of injections derived from dried spinal cord. The boy survived. The public relief was instantaneous and immense. The young man's survival was read as a vindication of Pasteur's method and as a demonstration that the laboratory could indeed save a human life faced with a classical inexorable illness. The case, however, was not a simple triumph of therapeutic genius. Contemporaries asked uncomfortable questions. Pasteur was a chemist, not a licensed physician. Did he have the right to place a child at risk? The French Académie de Médecine and many professional doctors, who were still carving out an identity amid the growing scientific authority of men like Pasteur, bristled at the idea that a laboratory could bypass clinical training. There were ethics even then: consent, competence, and the integrity of experimental practice. Pasteur's defenders argued that in case of near certainty of death, experimental treatment was not only defensible but humane. His critics feared a precedent that would allow scientists to experiment on humans in the name of progress. The debate touched a nerve that would echo through later controversies over human experimentation grown out of curiosity and necessity. The public response predictably overwhelmed the critics. Word spread across Europe and into far-flung colonial cities. A vaccine existed that could prevent rabies after exposure. Money poured in, donations funded institutions, governments wrote to Pasteur asking for help. The Pasteur Institutes were soon established. The Paris Institute formalized as a centre for research and treatment, and satellite institutes were founded in other countries in the decades that followed, bringing his method and his institutional model, a hybrid of laboratory, clinic and charity, to the world. The image of the scientist as saviour crystallized. Where previously a bite meant a looming fatality, now parents could imagine a hospital bed, a regimented series of injections, an interposition of science between exposure and the dark finish of the disease. The vaccine's global dissemination was rapid and uneven. In some urban centres it became standard emergency treatment. In others its adoption was slowed by cost, by medical conservatism, or by logistic obstacles. The early Pasteurian vaccines were labour-intensive. Rabbits had to be infected, their cords dried, preparations made and standardised. To scale up required animals, technicians, and centralised facilities. Yet the moral economy of prevention was compelling. Municipal authorities that had previously relied on culling and muzzling found in vaccination an alternative that promised fewer spectacles of death and, over time, lower public costs. A city that paid for a few hundred vaccine courses could claim a prophylactic advantage. A colony that established a Pasteur Institute could advertise to merchants that trading with it was safe. Pasteur's success reshaped public expectations about the power of science. The idea that a laboratory could hold in its methods a salvation for an ancient terror, that the sterile bench could oppose the chaotic bite, spread into politics and culture. The scientist became a public figure, and the public, dazzled by the apparent simplicity of the cure, came to expect more from scientific institutions. This was a double-edged sword. Trust in laboratories accelerated the funding of medical science, but it also created pressures that could lead to hasty experiments and to the paternal seizure of human bodies in the name of a greater good. Pasteur's gambit hence inaugurated not only a new technical capacity to control rabies, but also a set of ethical and social dilemmas about how and by whom such power should be exercised. Over the long arc of the 20th century, the crude spinal cord preparations that Pasteur pioneered would be replaced by safer, cell culture-based vaccines, and the world's management of rabies would shift from emergency responses to regularized public health strategies, routine vaccination of dogs in endemic countries, wildlife vaccination campaigns using bait-delivered vaccines in parts of Europe and North America, and systematic public education about avoiding exposure and seeking immediate treatment. But the landscape of expectations, the institutional architecture of Pasteur institutes, and the moral questions raised by human experimentation remained as legacies of that dramatic moment in the laboratory. What began on city streets with muzzles and municipal edicts had thus been reoriented toward a laboratory bench, where scientists weighed spinal cords on scales of days, not seasons. The Mad Dog laws had civilized the politics of fear. Pasteur's vaccine civilized the fear itself. Both solutions, the stick of the law and the syringe of the laboratory, carried costs and created new inequalities. The leash and the needle, each in its way, became instruments of power, the first to discipline bodies in public life, the second to discipline nature and to promise deliverance. And as the 20th century unfolded, people learned that neither instrument alone was enough. Prevention required the bureaucracy that muzzles had inaugurated, the laboratories that Pasteur had inspired, and a public willing to invest in both. The history so far is a lesson in the strange economy of safety. Fear makes law, law makes institutions, institutions create science, and science returns to transform the fears that gave it birth. The incubation of rabies has always had the feel of a secret kept too long. Weeks, sometimes months of ordinary life thinning into a hush before the storm. A child plays with a street dog in a Mediterranean courtyard. A hunter in the Caucasus brings home a fox bite during winter. A missionary in rural Bihar is scratched by a stray as she stoops to pick up a bundle. Nothing at first. The wound heals, the world resumes its textures and chores, and yet beneath the skin a tiny intruder edges along axons, taking the railway of nerves back toward the brain. This is what made rabies uncanny for centuries. Not that it struck swiftly, but that it struck after patience, after forgetting. Louis Pasteur, the man who would tie his name to salvation, wrote in the 1880s of the disease's peculiar timing, how it could smoulder in the body like an unlit candle and then flare. Joseph Meister, the 9-year-old boy he treated in Paris in July 1885, carried that pause in his memory before the vaccine did its work. For others, the pause ended in the most spectacular clinical catastrophe medicine has known. When the silence breaks, it does so with a small human list of complaints that could belong to any fever: malaise, headache, nausea, paresthesia at the sight of the bite, that curious crawling. Doctors in the 19th century noted these prodromal signs with the same clinical languor they applied to influenza or typhus. Then the central nervous system is invaded, and ordinary descriptions fail. The classical picture taught in medical schools and recorded in hospital casebooks is of the furious form, extreme agitation, hallucinations, and the now iconic hydrophobia. Patients seize at water with a maddened fear. They know they thirst, often can feel the liquid, and yet a reflexive spasm seizes the throat when a cup approaches the lips. The act of swallowing triggers painful constriction of the pharyngeal muscles, an involuntary laryngeal cough that is misread by lay observers as mere panic. Physicians, more blunt, described it as laryngospasm, the organism's cruel trick. Hypersalivation, the clinical trope of frothing at the mouth, is less a theatrical flourish than an autonomic storm. The salivary glands pour, sympathetic and parasympathetic centres misfire, and the patient becomes coated in a sheen that observers call foam. Convulsions come and go like waves. The delirium is vivid and often violent, a neurologic banquet that turns the sufferer into someone else. There is, as the textbooks gently insist, another face of rabies, the paralytic or dumb form. Less dramatic on the surface and therefore perhaps less notorious, it is no kinder. Here, rather than the violent episodes in hydrophobia, weakness creeps up like a tide. It may begin in the limb nearest the bite and ascend, a flaccid paralysis that can be confused with Guillain-Barré syndrome by modern neurologists. Because there is less shouting and spectacle, this form has in history sometimes been underdiagnosed, a quiet murderer that takes its toll in wards labelled failure to thrive, or complications of encephalitis, before laboratory work reveals the culprit. Epidemiologically, clinicians classically taught that roughly 4 out of 5 human rabies cases appear in the furious form. 1 out of 5 will tip toward paralysis. That ratio has shaped the law. Hydrophobia sits at the heart of the disease's dread precisely because it makes a spectacle that is easy to remember. What happens in the skull to produce such a range of behaviours is as compelling as it is grisly when explained without melodrama. The rabies virus, a bullet-shaped lysovirus, does not rush through the bloodstream and stage a widespread infection. Instead, it takes the long, private route. It docks at the neuromuscular junction and travels by retrograde axonal transport, a cellular elevator that moves it inch by inch, node by node, toward dorsal root ganglia and the brainstem. Along the way, it hides, replicates, adapts. The limbic system is a favoured target. The amygdala, hippocampus, the circuits of fear and emotion that, when disturbed, alter aggression and anxiety. The brainstem too is affected. It controls swallowing, respiration, and core autonomic functions, which is why hydrophobia and hypersalivation feel so intimate, so bodily. They're not merely psychological fears, but reflex arcs gone wrong. Pathologists have long observed that in rabies, the problem is functional as much as structural. Early in the disease, there can be surprisingly little overt neuronal death, even while the patient convulses and rages. The virus disturbs synaptic signaling, ion gradients, neurotransmitter balance, the electric music of the brain, more than it raises cells outright. This was visible in the first great histological discovery of the disease. In Pavia in Mao 3, an Italian pathologist named Adelchi Nesri opened the brains of animals and described peculiar inclusion bodies in the cytoplasm of neurons, compact eosinophilic granules in hippocampal pyramidal cells and cerebellar Purkinje neurons. Negri bodies were quickly taken as pathognomonic. They were the microscopic stamp of rabies. Through much of the 20th century, the identification of Negri bodies in a brain smear was the post-mortem seal of the disease. Later, more careful autopsy work refined the picture. Perivascular cuffing, immune cells pressed around vessels, and microglial activation, neuronal degeneration in scattered patterns, and a strange paucity of diffuse inflammatory destruction in some cases. It was as if the virus preferred to interrupt the conversation among neurons rather than burn down the room, and that interruption was catastrophic for the living person. Patient narratives make that catastrophe real in ways cold science cannot. In the archives of European hospitals and colonial medical stations, accounts pile up. The farmer in Romania who, bitten in the face by a shepherd's dog in 1892, returned to the clinic 2 months later with a dry throat and a smile he could not control. The missionary in late Victorian Ceylon whose medical note reads, with resigned brutality, refuses water, breathes through clenched teeth, fatal on day 5. Their medical charts document clinical rhythms, a day of sleepiness followed by sudden agitation, a night of screaming that is only intermittently relieved by sedatives, a final quieting as the body collapses into respiratory failure. Physicians of the era recorded the inevitability with a kind of learned sorrow. Once the brain was involved, hope for recovery was slender at best. We should not sentimentalise the inevitability. There have always been exceptions, not many, but enough to keep clinicians from abandoning attempts at aggressive care. The single most famous exception, which belongs more to the history of public health than to the clinical course of established disease, is the success of post-exposure vaccination instituted by Pasteur in 1885. Joseph Meister's bite was treated before symptoms, and the rabies that might have been never materialised. For those who developed the full symptomatic disease, however, the story remained bleak into the modern era. Death followed almost always within days to a few weeks of symptom onset. The crude mathematics of hospital mortality were stark. Once clinical rabies appears, survival is a statistical anomaly. That near inevitability is precisely what pushed clinicians and scientists to improve diagnostics. For generations, confirmation came only with autopsy, a calm, final verification in the chilled rooms of pathology departments. Negri's discovery provided the first reliable post-mortem test, but a deadly disease that kills so quickly when it declares itself demanded that we detect it earlier, while intervention might yet matter. In the middle of the 20th century, a technical leap made that possible: immunofluorescence. Albert H. Coons in Boston had developed the fluorescent antibody technique in the early 1940s, and by the 1950s and 1960s, laboratories in Europe and North America had adapted this method to rabies antigen detection. The direct fluorescent antibody test on brain impression smears became, almost overnight in laboratory years, the standard for rapid post-mortem diagnosis. A technician could, with the right reagents, see specific viral antigen glowing against a dark background. Within hours, an answer could be produced rather than days. That kind of temporal economy mattered not only for scientific curiosity, but for public health. If a dead dog that had bitten a child could be confirmed rabid in the morning, decisions about vaccinating exposed people and about quarantine measures could be made before noon. Yet the fluorescent antibody test, brilliant though it was, belonged to the post-mortem world. Detecting rabies in a living person posed additional challenges and required a subtler palette. Serology, measurements of neutralizing antibodies using techniques like the Rapid Fluorescent Focus Inhibition Test, RFIT, could tell whether someone had mounted an immune response, either to infection or to vaccination. Cerebrospinal fluid sometimes showed antibodies once the central nervous system was engaged. Corneal impressions, a delicate scraping of the corneal epithelium, could reveal antigen by fluorescent antibody. Nuchal skin biopsies taken from the hair-bearing skin at the back of the neck, where the virus often lodges in nerve endings, could be stained or tested for viral RNA. Then, toward the end of the 20th century, molecular biology arrived to rearrange the diagnostic deck. Kary Mullis's invention of the polymerase chain reaction in 1983 was, in ways he never intended, a turning point for infectious disease diagnosis. Reverse transcription PCR, RT-PCR, applied to RNA viruses like rabies, allowed laboratories to amplify tiny quantities of viral genetic material from saliva, skin, or cerebrospinal fluid. In the 90s and into the 2000s, many reference centres adopted RT-PCR protocols that could detect lyssavirus genomes with a sensitivity that surpassed earlier techniques for ante-mortem specimens. The promise was intoxicating: a throat swab, a couple of millilitres of saliva, or a tiny fragment of scapular skin could yield molecular confirmation. In practice, there were limits. Rabies virus shedding in saliva is intermittent. A single negative swab does not exclude infection. RT-PCR of Nuchal skin is sensitive only if the biopsy includes hair follicles with innervating nerves and is taken at the right stage of illness. Laboratories therefore recommend multiple samples, repeated over time to increase the probability of detection. In short, RT-PCR improved our ability to detect the invisible, but it did not give infallibility. The next step after PCR was sequencing, and here the benefits were not only diagnostic but detective. By the 2000s, next-generation sequencing allowed scientists to read whole viral genomes quickly and compare strains from different places. Molecular epidemiologists used genetic fingerprints to trace the sources of outbreaks, distinguishing, for example, whether a human case implicated a local dog population or a bat reservoir. This capacity transformed public health response. An isolated human case in the provinces might suddenly demand a regional animal vaccination campaign if sequencing proved the virus matched a local canine lineage. Forensically, genetics could tie human victims to specific animals or clusters of animals, a capability that has sometimes been used in legal and policy contexts. Imagine, historians like to say, telling the mayor that the bomb in his city had come not from foreign soil, but from the negligent control of municipal dogs, and then being able to show the phylogenetic tree that proved it. Throughout this development, clinicians, laboratorians, and public health officials learned a central lesson. Speed and sampling strategy matter as much as the method. The fluorescent antibody test on brain tissue remained the gold standard for postmortem diagnosis because it combined simplicity with high sensitivity and specificity. RT-PCR provided ante-mortem options that saved time in living patients, but required careful sampling and interpretation. Serology provided context for vaccine response and for late confirmations. Culture, once the province of research labs, became less central for routine diagnosis, but remained important for reference studies and for understanding viral biology. And with every advance came a set of logistic realities: reagents, cold chains, trained personnel, biosafety levels, and the peculiar tyranny of resource distribution. A well-equipped laboratory in Geneva could confirm a case in hours. A rural clinic 1,000 kilometres away might wait days for a courier, if it received testing at all. Those disparities in detection mattered because they shaped treatment decisions. From Louis Pasteur's first experiments in the 1880s onward, the idea that one could vaccinate after exposure, that the immune system might be primed before the virus reached its final perilous niche, had smashed a central fear. Pasteur and Émile Roux's attenuated spinal cord virus preparation saved the first human life they tried to spare in 1885. The principle was galvanizing. When faced with a potentially rabid bite, do something and do it fast. The history of post-exposure prophylaxis is a ledger of incremental improvements built on that observation. In the decades after Pasteur, prophylactic materials were crude by modern standards, but often effective. Early 20th century vaccine production relied on nerve tissue, the spinal cord of infected rabbits or other animals, inactivated with phenol or similar agents. Sir David Semple, working in British India in the early 1900s, developed a phenol-inactivated nerve tissue vaccine that was inexpensive and practicable in vast colonial clinics. It would be used in many parts of the world for much of the 20th century. The Semple vaccine and its cousins were saving lives, but they came with a price: allergic reactions, neurological complications, and inconsistent potency. Over time, as cell culture techniques matured, safer, more immunogenic vaccines were introduced. Human diploid cell vaccine, HDCV, appeared in the latter half of the 20th century. Purified chick embryo cell vaccines and Vero, cell-derived preparations followed. These cell culture vaccines were more consistent, less reactogenic, and ultimately became the standard in wealthy countries by the 1970s and 80s. The World Health Organization, noting the superior safety profile, recommended phasing out nerve tissue vaccines in favor of cell culture products. The transition would take decades in poorer regions because of cost and manufacturing complexity. Post-exposure prophylaxis as practiced today is classical in its components: meticulous wound cleansing, infiltration of rabies immunoglobulin into and around category 3 wounds when available, and a timely schedule of vaccine doses, either intramuscularly or, in resource-conserving regimens approved by WHO, intradermally. The logic is simple and elegant. Wound cleaning reduces inoculum and, if started immediately, can halve the risk of progression. Passive immunization with rabies immunoglobulin, RIG, provides immediate neutralizing antibodies to mop up virus at the exposure site. It is particularly important for severe exposures to the head or neck, or when the patient has no prior vaccination history. RIG exists in two principal forms: human rabies immunoglobulin, HRIG, which has the advantage of lower risk for serum sickness, and equine rabies immunoglobulin, ARIG, which is cheaper and widely used in low-income countries, but carries a higher risk of allergic reaction if not properly purified. Finally, active immunization with vaccine stimulates the patient's own antibody production, building long-term protection over a series of injections. The specifics of vaccine schedules have been honed over the last century with remarkable pragmatism. The intramuscular regimens, often known by geographic names like the Essen schedule, typically involve multiple injections over a month, designed to provoke a rapid and durable immune response. Intradermal regimens, including the Thai Red Cross protocol developed in Thailand in the latter half of the 20th century, use far lower antigen doses delivered into the skin, where immune cells patrol. The skin's immunologic richness allows a smaller amount of vaccine to generate sufficient immunity in many individuals. The economics are transformative. In countries where a full vial of cell culture vaccine might be unaffordable for an entire family, intradermal delivery permits clinics to stretch doses and vaccinate more people. WHO endorsed and promoted intradermal regimens precisely because the barrier to death in poor communities is often not ignorance, but cost and supply. And yet gaps persist. One of the cruelest truths about rabies in the global era is that the biological intervention is bluntly effective and economically uneven. Modern cell culture vaccines and immunoglobulins cost money. Cold chains must be maintained. Clinics need trained staff who know how to administer intradermal injections and how to infiltrate RIG into wounds rather than merely giving it intramuscularly, where it cannot perform its localized function. In much of sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia, patients still present after bites without access to prompt PEP. The result is predictably tragic. While vaccines have eliminated canine-mediated human rabies in parts of Europe and the Americas over the last half-century, the disease continues to exact a toll in poorer regions. A widely cited estimate by Hampson and colleagues in 2015 put the global death toll at roughly 59,000 people a year, almost all in Africa and Asia. That statistic is not a mere number. It is a ledger of delayed clinics, empty refrigerators, and the absence of a vial. These inequities provide the context for the truly spectacular and also for the quietly infuriating case studies that litter rabies history. Pasteur's Joseph Meister remains the archetype of post-exposure success, a child in Paris whose life was spared by a scientist willing to try a risky new intervention. In 2004, another story broke the doom-like rhythm for a moment. Gianna Gieser, a 15-year-old from Wisconsin, arrived at a hospital with symptomatic rabies and was treated with a protocol that induced coma and combined antiviral agents, immune modulation and intensive support, the so-called Milwaukee Protocol developed by a team led by Dr. Rodney Willoughby Jr. The case was the first well-documented survival of unvaccinated, symptomatic rabies in a previously healthy person, and it electrified journals and newspapers. In the years since, however, attempts to replicate that success have largely failed. The Milwaukee Protocol did not become a reliable cure, so much as a bold experiment that occasionally yielded a miracle. That scarcity of miracles is the clinical reality. Symptomatic rabies remains extraordinarily difficult to reverse. On the other hand, the history of prevention is studded with examples of triumph when systems and logistics align. In Latin America, a coordinated program led by the Pan American Health Organization from the 80s onward combined mass dog vaccination with surveillance and improved PEP access. The region saw a dramatic drop in human rabies transmitted by dogs. In parts of Asia, national campaigns to subsidize or provide free PP to rural populations have reduced deaths when the political will and funding are present. Bangladesh, after years of pilot programs and partnerships with international organizations in the 2000s and 2010s, expanded access to modern PEPI and concentrated on community awareness. Mortality fell. These are not small administrative victories. They are the tangible algebra of prevention. Vaccinate the dog, vaccinate the person, clean the wound, give immune globulin when needed, and keep the vaccine cold. That algebra, however, is as much about systems as it is about serum. Stock management, training in intradermal technique, public education to seek care immediately after a bite, and legal frameworks for responsible dog ownership are all logistical cogs. In the late 20th and early 21st centuries, the global health community reached a rare consensus. The scientifically and economically efficient way to eliminate most human rabies is to control it at the source, dogs, and to make PEP reliably available for those humans who still fall through the safety net. In the 2010s, this consensus hardened into a campaign. International agencies and non-governmental organisations framed an ambitious target to end dog-mediated human rabies deaths by 2030. It is a plan that depends not only on laboratory breakthroughs or a better vaccine, but on the 1,000 small administrative acts that make public health practical. Vaccine procurement, mapping of dog populations, training of paraveterinarians, cold chain maintenance, and the political courage to fund prevention in places where the victims are poor and loudly unproductive. The historical arc of post-exposure prophylaxis, from Pasteur's attenuated spinal cords to today's intradermal regimens and cell culture vaccines, has been a rare public health success story in terms of technology. Where it has faltered is in distribution. Many of the tragedies still recorded in medical literature and obituaries are not catastrophes of science, but catastrophes of logistics. A vial ran out. A nurse did not know the intradermal technique. A clinic was one train ride away in the wrong season. The lesson is old and simple. A vaccine in a freezer is only prevention when someone opens the door and gives it to the person who needs it. The irony and the absurdity of rabies is that the means to prevent most human deaths are obvious and available, while the failure to prevent them often lies in matters as prosaic as budgeting and transportation. And so the story of rabies in the 20th and 21st centuries is a two-track narrative. On the one hand, a steadily improving toolbox of diagnostics and prophylaxis, born of Pasteur and refined by the molecular biology. On the other, a stubborn shadow cast by inequality, by the distribution of cold boxes and the availability of a vial. The clinical catastrophe of symptomatic rabies, the hydrophobic terrified patient, the paralytic sleeper, remains among medicine's most dreadful spectres. The tools to prevent that catastrophe have been known for well over a century. The challenge now is not merely scientific, it is logistical, administrative and moral. The beast that once loomed as an inscrutable curse now stands in many ways revealed. It is time to treat it as the preventable misfortune it has become in so many places. For those who have seen the technical details, the Negri body under a microscope in 1903 in Pavia, the fluorescent antigen glowing in a slide in a mid-century lab, the polymerase chain reaction amplifying a scrap of viral genome in a late 20th century machine. The moral clarity is simple. We can diagnose earlier, we can prevent more, and we must. As the night closes over wards and clinics, and as the bedside lamps are dimmed in small towns and big cities alike, the practical tasks remain. Clean the bite, send the specimen to the lab, administer immunoglobulin if warranted. Start the vaccine, intradermal where it will save more lives on a budget. Train a new generation of nurses in the technique that stretches each vial like a small blessing. Map dog populations and vaccinate them in campaigns that are as much social engineering as veterinary medicine. Each procedural step is, in its own way, a counterspell to the old dread. It is not a romantic story. It is a logistics problem solved every day, quietly, by people who do not expect medals. That work, neither lyrical nor melodramatic, but meticulous and humane, is what saves lives from the most dreaded of diseases. In the quiet, messy web of animals that surround us, the rabies virus found its many homes and learned to whisper from one species to another, sometimes as an intimate secret, sometimes as a roaring epidemic. Dogs have been the principal interlocutors of that whisper for centuries, their tails and collars braided into human society in such a way that they carried with them not only companionship but, on darker days, an ancient pathogen. In much of Asia and Africa, the domestic dog remains the primary source of human rabies, a simple epidemiological fact with enormous practical consequences. If you can reach the dog, you can cut the human death toll. That is the arithmetic that has animated campaigns, policies and arguments in ministries and field clinics from New Delhi to Dar es Salaam, because dogs are tangible, visible and amenable to the blunt instruments of public health, vaccines, leashes and sometimes legislation. But the animal kingdom is not so obliging. A complex ecology of wildlife reservoirs, bats that hang like grudging ornaments from caves and trees, raccoons that shuffle in the thin towns of the eastern United States, red foxes that thumb the hedgerows of Europe, skunks with their nocturnal salt and pepper faces, small Indian mongooses in Caribbean gardens, and the blood-feeding vampire bats of Latin America sustains the virus in places where the dog's reach is limited. Each of these hosts is not merely a carrier, but an evolutionary crucible in which genetically distinct variants are brewed, adapting to bodies and behaviours that differ profoundly from human households. You can tell the long ecological story in small telling episodes. In the eastern United States, rabies acquired a new face in the late 20th century after a human decision with ill-considered consequences, the translocation of raccoons for hunting in the 1970s. Those animals carried a variant of rabies suited to raccoons, and the variant, once introduced, spread with the slow, inevitable geometry of an ecological invader, marching along river corridors, hitching rides in human refuse, filling niches left by other predators. The expansion of raccoon rabies became a textbook case of how human movement and wildlife behaviour conspire to create new patterns of disease. In Europe, the mid-20th century saw red foxes emerge as the principal reservoir in many regions, sustaining an epizootic that by the 1970s had become a major public health and agricultural nuisance. Up north, the Arctic fox keeps its own distant lineage alive across tundra and ice, and in the tropical Americas, Desmodus rotundus, the common vampire bat, makes livestock, and sometimes humans pay for stray nights, creating localized but persistent cycles of transmission that cannot be ignored by ministries of agriculture and commerce. Beneath these stories lies a genetic tectonics. Rabies virus is not a single unchanging thing, but a genus, virus, whose species and lineages have been shaped by centuries of association with particular hosts. Sequencing and phylogenetic studies, many led by laboratories like those of Paul Burhi in Paris and collaborators across the globe, have revealed elegant if troubling patterns. Canine rabies lineages spread with human trade and colonial expansion, the cosmopolitan strains moving with ships and caravans across continents in the 19th and early 20th centuries, while bat-associated viruses in the Americas pursue a far older, more local history, diversifying in place among dozens of species of insectivorous and haematophagous bats. Where a virus crosses the species barrier, it sometimes finds a new, surprising foothold. Once in a while, a host shift leads to sustained transmission in a new reservoir, reorganizing the local epidemiology. Such shifts are the biological equivalent of settling a new town. The conditions must be right, the virus must be capable of infecting and being shed by the new host, and the ecological neighbourhood must permit continued circulation. We have seen this happen more often than we might have expected, because the world is full of ecological openings and human movements that widen them. This is why surveillance, careful molecular patient surveillance, matters in ways that feel almost prosaic when compared with the drama of a single fatal case. Sequencing an isolate from a dog in a Tanzanian village and comparing it with samples from a fox in Belarus and a bat in Brazil tells us about connections invisible to the eye. It tells us whether an outbreak is a local flare from endemic circulation or an importation that threatens new territory. Charles Ruprecht and teams at the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, Paul Burhi's network at the Institut Pasteur, and field epidemiologists like Tiziana Lembo in East Africa have, through patient sampling and analysis, mapped the ways in which different species transmit rabies and how variants adapt. These maps do practical work. They show where to invest in vaccination, where to place oral baits, and where transboundary agreements are not optional but essential. Bats, in particular, complicate any tidy plan. They are mobile in ways that terrestrial mammals are not. They congregate in large, dense roosts, and they interact with human habitations in unexpected ways, under the eaves of houses, deep in tourist cave-ears, in abandoned buildings reclaimed by colonies. The Lyssavirus genus contains a number of bat-associated members. European bat lyssaviruses, EBLV1 and EBLV2, Duvenhage virus in southern Africa, Lagos bat virus and Macola virus in Africa, and the Australian bat lyssavirus, ABLV, first described in the mid-90s. These are not portmanteau curiosities. They are concrete dangers because some are antigenically removed from classical rabies virus, and for others, our understanding of cross-protection by standard vaccines is incomplete. The technical language, phylogroups I and II antigenic distance, translates into a blunt public health truth. Not every lyssavirus conforms to the immunological envelope of the human vaccines we rely upon, and bat-borne lyssaviruses often arrive stealthily. A bat bite can be so small as to go unnoticed. A child finds a grounded bat and seeks to save it. Rescuers or splunkers handle bats and later present to clinics with non-specific symptoms. Surveillance is often minimal in the very places where bat-human interactions are most frequent, so detection lags, and the window for effective post-exposure prophylaxis, PP, can slip, all of which returns us to the pragmatic instruments that have been shown to work at scale. Vaccination, both of animals and humans, is the blunt, rational, and sadly underfinanced answer to a problem that is conceptually straightforward. Stop the chain of transmission at its commonest node, the dog, or reduce the ability of wildlife reservoirs to spill over into domestic animals and humans. Mass dog vaccination campaigns, implemented with the logistical rigour of a large-scale public project, can break the cycle of dog-mediated human rabies. The epidemiological rule of thumb is familiar to field workers. Vaccinate roughly 70% of the dog population, and you create herd immunity sufficient to interrupt transmission. That figure is not a magic number, but a practical target that has been borne out in experiments and campaigns in both wealthy and resource-poor settings. In the Serengeti ecosystem and in rural Tanzania, for example, work by Lembo and colleagues in the late 2000s demonstrated that organised, community-based vaccination could achieve such coverage, and crucially that once achieved, incidents of rabies in both dogs and people fell. Those were controlled, painstaking studies, vaccinators with nets and syringes, community meetings, agonising calculations about dog population turnover, and their message was austere but hopeful. You can stop transmission with a well-run program that communities buy into. Latin America offers another larger canvas. Beginning in the 80s, the Pan American Health Organization coordinated a continent-wide effort in which mass dog vaccination and improved surveillance reduced canine rabies and dramatically lowered human deaths. The practical techniques were familiar: annual or biannual vaccination blitzes, targeted culling abandoned, and the application of epidemiological intelligence to redirect resources, but the scale and political commitment were distinguishing features. Countries that had been laboratories of neglect in earlier decades became ridings of success. Mexico and parts of Central America, Brazil in many states, and numerous others saw enormous declines in dog-mediated human rabies by the early 21st century. Those gains did not happen because a single vaccine was discovered. They happened because bureaucracies, funding streams, and communities all aligned to make vaccination a routine, funded action, rather than a sporadic emergency. Wildlife created a different set of tools, and with them innovations in delivery. Oral rabies vaccines, ORV, for wildlife are a technological fix to an ecological problem. Instead of chasing foxes with needles, you distribute bait that contains a vaccine. Foxes find the bait and immunise themselves. The method was first trialled at scale in Europe in the late 1970s and early 80s. Switzerland is often credited with pioneering these campaigns against fox rabies, and then refined into a powerful regional tool. Baits are baited with attractants, sometimes fish or chicken flavours, and coated or designed to release a recombinant vaccine. One commonly used is the Vaccinia rabies glycoprotein construct, VRG, that elicits protective immunity when an animal gnaws it. Aerial distribution from small planes or helicopters turns border regions into defensive belts. One nation's vaccination flights become a neighbour's buffer against an epizootic trying to cross a river or a mountain chain. In North America, ORV has been used to curtail the spread of raccoon rabies and to prevent spillover into previously rabies-free zones. There are limits, of course. ORV is logistically demanding, costly, and more suited to medium and large-scale orchestration than to ad hoc interventions. Yet the late 20th century saga of Europe's fox rabies decline and the containment of raccoon rabies in parts of Canada and the United States is a study in how ecological insight, vaccine science, and aerial logistics can combine to shrink a pathogen's geography. Where mass vaccination and wildlife strategies succeed, they often do so as part of an integrated One Health approach. The term can sound like bureaucratic jargon, an insistence that human health, animal health, and ecosystem health be aligned. Yet, in practice, One Health has been the precise explanation for why some programs work and others fail. When veterinary services, public health clinics, municipal governments, community leaders, and sometimes international NGOs coordinate, sharing data, resources, and personnel, vaccination coverage climbs and the number of treated human exposures drops. The Global Alliance for Rabies Control, the World Health Organization, the Food and Agriculture Organization, and the World Organization for Animal Health have all emphasized this model. In 2018, those bodies, along with partners, articulated the ambitious target known as 0 by 30, a goal to eliminate dog-mediated human rabies deaths by 2030. The goal is part moral claim, part logistical plan, vaccinate dogs, make PEP available and affordable, strengthen surveillance, and mobilise communities. The operational modalities of mass campaigns are where the romantic rhetoric meets the hard grind of logistics. There are lessons in the minutiae. A campaign that plans only one vaccination day in a community will miss dogs whose owners work or are elsewhere. Door-to-door campaigns are more costly but reach more animals. Central point clinics rely on owners bringing dogs, which does not happen in communities where dogs roam semi-freely. Cold chain requirements, keeping many millions of doses at the appropriate temperature, impose a predictable burden. Human resource constraints matter. Vaccinating tens of thousands of dogs requires trained teams with nets and syringes, vehicles that can negotiate muddy roads, and the administrative capacity to record and analyse coverage. In many places, the technical solution is straightforward, but funding is not. The campaigns that endure are those that find sustainable financing, whether through ministry budgets, local taxes, or international grants, because one-off drives will inevitably be undermined by the demographic turnover of dog populations. Sterilisation campaigns, animal birth control programs, have been integrated into some national strategies, particularly in India, where surgical sterilisation accompanied by vaccination has been used to reduce dog population turnover, improve community acceptance, and potentially increase vaccination coverage over time. Those programs are slow, expensive, and politically charged, but they are often part of a humane alternative to culling. Failures teach as well. Culling, once a reflexive policy in some places, has proved not only ethically fraught but epidemiologically ineffective. Removing dogs from a neighbourhood may temporarily reduce visible numbers, but it creates vacancies that are often quickly filled by the movement of animals from adjacent areas or by higher birth rates. The underlying transmission network reknits itself. In the mid-70s and again in later decades, translocation of animals, whether for sport as in the raccoon example, or inadvertently along trade routes, has created fresh ignition points. In some cases, political instability and poor coordination produce the worst outcomes. Inconsistent funding, interrupted campaigns, and a collapse of surveillance can allow rabies to reassert itself, as seen in episodes across parts of China in the 1990s when vaccination programs faltered, or in areas where cross-border cooperation is weak, and one country's success is continually threatened by its neighbour's lack of control. These are not failures of science so much as failures of sustained public will and administrative competence. There are also technical innovations that soften some of the harsh trade-offs. Intradermal regimens for human PEP reduce the amount of vaccine necessary per patient and, where implemented correctly, can dramatically reduce program costs. The development of monoclonal antibodies as alternatives to human or equine rabies immunoglobulin, products like the monoclonal preparations licensed in some markets, promises to make PEP more scalable by reducing reliance on scarce pooled human products. Thermostable vaccine formulations for animals that do not require strict cold chains are under evaluation and could ease delivery in remote settings. Molecular diagnostics and routine sequencing enable surveillance not merely of presence or absence, but of lineages and trends, making targeted responses possible. Yet these scientific advances bump inexorably against the hard realities of inequality. Rabies is often called a neglected disease because it kills the poorest among us disproportionately. The epidemiological burden is concentrated in low and middle-income countries where access to PEP is patchy, where veterinary infrastructure is thin, and where healthcare decisions are made at kitchen tables with money that must stretch to food and school fees. The World Health Organization and collaborators estimated in the 2010s that tens of thousands of people, commonly cited as about 59,000 per year, continue to die from rabies, the vast majority in Asia and Africa, with countries like India historically accounting for a very large slice of those deaths. What those numbers compress is a landscape of concrete, solvable scarcities. Public clinics that have no rabies vaccine in stock, rural families who cannot afford multiple trips to a health centre for Pet B, veterinary services that exist in the capital but not beyond, and surveillance systems that do not reliably record animal cases. Give me a single clinic in a remote village, and I will give you the problem. Vaccines must be bought, refrigerated, and administered by trained staff. Immunoglobulin, which can halt progression after a severe exposure, must often be flown in at great expense or else simply is not available. When a family cannot afford an immediate trip to a health centre, or when the clinic itself has no stock, the consequence is tragically predictable. Add to that the social dimensions. Dogs in some places are not kept under the control of single owners, but are community dogs. In other places, religious or cultural beliefs make handling dogs difficult, and you have a picture of logistical resistance that is not fixed by a single policy. Some countries have tried to bridge these gaps. Bangladesh, for example, invested in both community education and PEP access and saw reductions in deaths. Sri Lanka's long-term campaigns that combine dog vaccination with public education and PEP provision produced substantial declines in mortality over decades. Those are instances that prove a simple point. Where politics aligns with policy and funding follows evidence, lives fall away from the grim ledger. Why does rabies remain neglected while other diseases attract enormous pots of donor cash? Part of the answer lies in visibility and narrative. HIV, malaria and tuberculosis fit into global frameworks and have constituencies, research networks, advocacy groups and donor commitments that secure sustained investment. Rabies, by contrast, is episodic in the policy imagination. 1,000 deaths scattered across rural districts do not magnetise media attention the way an epidemic in a city does. It is also cross-sectoral in a way that frustrates funding silos. Public health budgets cannot easily be repurposed to buy dog vaccines, and agricultural budgets resist being funneled into human clinics. Donors, responding to political incentives and measurable short-term returns, prefer interventions that show fast, visible success and align with their strategic narratives. The sustained patient work required to eliminate dog-mediated rabies Repeated vaccination campaigns, robust surveillance, cross-border coordination, community engagement rarely fits that pattern. This is an essentially political problem as much as a scientific or logistical one. Take borders. No country is an island when it comes to dogs and wildlife. A province free of rabies across a river from uncontrolled territory is always at risk. Reinvasion is not merely possible but probable unless regional cooperation is in place. Or consider budget cycles. Ministries operate on annual appropriations, yet rabies elimination demands consistent funding over many years. Or consider legal frameworks, reporting systems, responsible ownership laws, and municipal animal control regulations are the scaffolding upon which vaccination campaigns must climb, and where those scaffolds are weak, campaigns collapse into reactive, emergency-driven efforts. Moreover, social attitudes matter. In some communities, a dog is part of the family and will be brought for vaccination. In others, it is a scavenger to be shooed away. And in still others, a dog is both. And that ambivalence complicates messaging. A campaign that fails to understand these local sensibilities will, however scientifically sound, fail. There are nevertheless stories that suggest how the political problem can be solved. Latin America's multi-decadal campaign combined technical guidance, financing modalities that supported sustained action, and regional governance that made cross-border coordination routine. In parts of Africa and Asia, pilot projects that paired mass dog vaccination with free or subsidized PEP showed how coupling animal and human interventions produces a multiplier effect. Fewer exposures reduce demand for expensive PEP, which in turn frees funds for more vaccination. India's legal experiments in the governance of stray dogs, the animal birth control rules and sterilization programs combined with mass vaccination in some municipal areas have at times demonstrated how humane methods can be marshalled in pursuit of public health goals. International initiatives like 0 by 30 provide an organising narrative and technical roadmap. What they lack, as every fieldworker will tell you over cups of bland tea in district offices, is the consistent political will to fund the bridge between pilot and scale. The technical and logistical parts of the problem, vaccines, cold chains, trained personnel, oral bait design, sequencing, are by now largely solvable. The core gap is governance and financing, sustained investment in veterinary services, robust surveillance systems, and integrated human-animal health programs deployed at the scale of contiguous epidemiological regions rather than at the caprice of local political cycles. It is a familiar paradox. The cheapest cure in human terms is to vaccinate dogs, yet the money to vaccinate dogs often comes from the same scarce pools that could instead buy expensive human PEP. The rational economic argument that dog vaccination is cost-effective and that, over time, it reduces the need for PEP has been made many times, with modelling and field data to support it. But rationality alone does not reorient budgets. Politics does. So the final scene is not one of heroic science overcoming nature in a single strike, nor is it the narrative of inevitable human failure against an ancient virus. It is instead a long, practical choreography. Planes drop baits that smell like fish and glitter among hedgerows. Teams of vaccinators move through villages at dawn. Nets whisper closed over reluctant necks. Cold boxes hiss with precious vials, and public health nurses teach mothers how to wash a wound and when to come for PEP. It is national budgets that sustain these rhythms and international coalitions that help when they do not. It is communities that accept or reject campaigns and whose daily choices determine whether the virus can find enough hosts to survive. Rabies persists where governance frays and where access is unequal. It retreats where the chain of transmission is understood and broken at its most common node. There is an elegance in that, a disease taught by centuries of interaction to haunt animals, to exploit our blind spots, to take advantage of poverty and bureaucratic fracture, can also be tamed by ordinary public health measures if politics and science find their proper correspondences. The animal kingdom will continue to host variants and vectors, bats will continue to darken ceilings and foxes prowl hedgerows, but a future in which dog-mediated human rabies is vanishingly rare is within our grasp, provided that the steady, unsexy work of vaccination surveillance and systems building is prioritised and financed. It is a patient work, like stitching a vast invisible quilt across landscapes and borders. It requires not one luminous discovery, but many small coordinated acts. It requires that we be finally more diligent than the virus's patient. Treating symptomatic rabies is always read like an impossible arithmetic. By the time the mind shows that it is no longer quite itself, by the time hydrophobia tightens the throat and the light in the eyes goes wrong, medicine has precious little to offer. For 2 centuries, the ledger was grimly simple. Rabies was the disease that would take you, with almost ritual certainty, once the first clear neurological signs appeared. That near impossibility was not abstract. It shaped how doctors triage patients, how families answered the knock at the door at night, how villages and cities decided whether to round up packs of dogs or to keep them. It created a moral geography. Some people could be protected by money and distance, others could not. And it created, in its rare exceptions, an enormous fascination, because a single human survival against such odds looks like a miracle and invites, at once, extraordinary hope and cautious, bitter skepticism. So when a quiet Wisconsin hospital in 2004 became the stage for what would be called, with breathtaking retail speed, the Milwaukee Protocol, the world leaned in. Gianna Gieser, a 15-year-old girl bitten by a bat, arrived at the Children's Hospital of Wisconsin in critical condition. Unlike the many people who die of rabies without a whisper of treatment, Gina had never received post-exposure prophylaxis. She had not been vaccinated before the onset of symptoms. Under the leadership of Dr. Rodney Willoughby Jr., the clinical team did something radical by the standards of neurology and infectious disease. They sent the brain to sleep. They induced a deep sedation and a medically controlled coma, administered antiviral agents, ribavirin and amantadine among them, and provided meticulous round-the-clock intensive care, buoying lungs and kidneys and metabolism while the patient was buffered from the harmful cascade of neuronal firing that accompanies rabies. After many harrowing weeks, Gina emerged, confused at first, then recovering more of herself than anyone had thought possible. It was, to most observers, a miracle. Miracles are persuasive. The Milwaukee Protocol turned hospital beds into a kind of litmus test for what we would try when the odds were terrible. Within months, teams around the world were reading the case reports, and in places where the necessary technology and resources existed, attempting variations on the theme. Ketamine and other sedatives were tried, antiviral cocktails were tweaked, supportive care was sustained for weeks or months. Each new attempt became an ethical drama as much as a clinical one. Families begged for the chance, clinicians argued about futility, magazines wrote breathless headlines, and grant-makers watched for reproducible success. The reality that emerged over the following decade was neither simple triumph nor unrelenting failure. Dozens of reports described attempts to replicate the Milwaukee approach. A handful of patients indeed survived after aggressive experimental treatment. Yet systematic reviews and careful analyses, published in the medical literature in the years that followed, pulled the lens back and painted a more complicated picture. Successes were rare. Many of the survivors had been infected with bat-associated rabies virus variants, rather than the classical canine strains. In some cases, patients showed evidence of pre-existing or very early immune responses that likely influenced outcome. The correlation between the induced coma and survival was, at best, muddied by these cofactors. In short, the protocol could not be proven, with the data then available, to be the decisive variable that turned an almost certain death into life. That ambiguity produced not only scientific debate but profound ethical friction. On the one hand, there was the moral intuition that one must try, especially when the patient is a child and the tools, sedation, ventilation, antivirals, are in principle available. On the other hand, there was the hard arithmetic of intensive care, days and weeks of ventilator dependence, costly antiviral drugs used off-label, the need for nurses and specialists to sustain the bedside care that strangers in far corners of the world could not afford. There was the question of informed consent under the shadow of desperation. There was the problem of therapeutic misconception, where families equate experimentation with proven hope. And there was the global inequity that made the debate a moral indictment. In the very places where most rabies deaths happen, rural districts in India, parts of sub-Saharan Africa, there is no access to post-exposure vaccines and no intensive care units to offer the Milwaukee Protocol at all. To offer an intensive, experimental, resource-heavy therapy in a high-income hospital, and to deny even basic rabies immunization to those in low-income settings raises sharp questions about priorities and justice. Those tensions produced a spectrum of responses among clinicians and ethicists. Some argued that the protocol, even if imperfect, represented a duty of care. When survival is possible, one must try. Others pushed back, urging that the best medical and moral choice, particularly in environments where resources are scarce, is to focus on prevention and palliative comfort rather than on a long and invasive attempt that is unlikely to change the outcome. Many middle voices called for rigorous research rather than ad hoc improvisation, a hard thing to accomplish with a disease that is common, where resources are scarce and rare in the clinical settings, where trials can be run ethically and with oversight. Randomized trials, the gold standard for testing interventions, have been impractical and to some ethically problematic. Who would randomize a desperate family to comfort care in a scenario where there might be hope? The research community has therefore leaned on careful observational studies, registries and retrospective analyses, and those have suggested that the Milwaukee Protocol, though not worthless, is far from a panacea. From the handful of survivors, however, medicine has extracted important lessons that are less dramatic than a coma but potentially more powerful. Immunology, for instance, has taught a blunt lesson. The presence of neutralizing antibodies in the blood and cerebrospinal fluid correlates strongly with survival. Patients who mounted an early humoral response, who had measurable virus-neutralizing antibodies within the central nervous system, did better than those who did not. That observation reframes the problem. If rabies were simply a matter of destroying the virus directly once it had entered the brain, many antiviral strategies might suffice. But the pattern suggests that the immune system's ability to produce the right kind of antibodies in the right compartments matters enormously. Survivors have therefore been studied as natural experiments in host defense, genetic predispositions, prior subclinical exposures, the particular viral variant that infected them. All these factors are being mapped, in the hope of finding clues for therapies that might tip the balance more reliably than a medically induced coma. Those clues point toward therapeutics that are more targeted and that bring us to the quiet revolution taking shape in laboratories and biotech incubators around the globe. The same resolute logic that has made monoclonal antibodies a staple in oncology and immunology is being applied to rabies. For decades, passive immunization after a high-risk bite depended on two imperfect and costly resources: human rabies immunoglobulin, harvested from plasma donors, and equine rabies immunoglobulin, produced from horse serum and associated with risk of allergic reactions. Supplies have always been limited, and costs have been prohibitive in many countries. Monoclonal antibodies, engineered to neutralize rabies virus glycoprotein with high specificity, promise to replace plasma-derived products with something more consistent, scalable, and, if production can be industrialized, cheaper. But the virus is a tricky object. It has antigenic diversity across geographic regions and among different host species. A single monoclonal antibody might neutralize one variant but not another. That is why modern candidates are not single antibodies but cocktails. 2, 3, or more monoclonals designed to bind distinct epitopes on the rabies glycoprotein, closing the avenues by which the virus could escape neutralization. Researchers have moved these cocktails into human trials. Small safety and immunogenicity studies have been completed in endemic regions, and in a few countries monoclonal products have achieved regulatory approval or conditional use. India, where the burden of dog-mediated rabies is high and the demand for passive immunization acute, has been an especially active market for such innovations. The introduction of locally produced monoclonal products there has been followed by intense scrutiny. Are single antibody products adequate? Are cocktails necessary? The World Health Organization, along with global partners, has been explicit that cocktails that cover antigenic variability are preferable, and it has urged standardized testing to ensure that the new products provide broad protection. Other vaccine technologies have matured in adjacent arenas and now promise to reshape prevention in ways that would have seemed fantastical a generation ago. The oral vaccines that once seemed marginal, vaccine-laden baits dropped in fox territories, became in the late 20th century a public health triumph in parts of Europe and North America. The Vaccinia rabies glycoprotein recombinant vaccine, known in the field as VRG, was a vector vaccine placed into edible baits and distributed across landscapes to interrupt sylvatic cycles in red foxes, raccoons, and coyotes. Where these programs were thorough, Germany, France, Belgium, and large tracts of the United States, they drove local elimination campaigns and significantly reduced spillover into humans. That success is a powerful lesson. Vaccines targeted at animal reservoirs can be extraordinarily cost-effective tools for preventing human disease. For humans, recombinant and viral vector platforms hold different promises and challenges. Adenovirus-vectored vaccines, chimpanzee adenoviruses among them, have been engineered to present rabies glycoprotein and have shown rapid induction of neutralizing antibodies in animal models and early-phase human studies. The advantage here is speed and potency. A single-shot vector might prime the immune system quickly enough to be useful in either pre-exposure contexts, covering field workers, veterinarians, and children in high-risk areas, or as a faster PEP component. After the COVID-19 pandemic, platforms such as mRNA and adenoviral vectors shed their aura of experimental novelty and entered mainstream production pipelines. mRNA vaccines, with their remarkable manufacturing flexibility and ability to induce strong immune responses, have been repurposed on paper and in early studies to tackle rabies glycoprotein, with the theoretical potential of thermostability improvements, dose sparing, and rapid scale-up. These are not minor matters. The most elegant vaccine in the world is useless if it requires a continuous cold chain to a remote village clinic, or if the manufacturer cannot scale production when a crisis demands it. The promise in the laboratory, however, runs headlong into the problems of regulation, manufacturing, and distribution. For monoclonal antibodies, the question is not only whether they neutralize the virus in a well-controlled trial, but whether they can be manufactured in quantities sufficient to supply an entire continent at an affordable price. Monoclonal antibody production is an industrial process that requires cell lines, bioreactors, stringent purification under good manufacturing practice conditions, and quality control that keeps every batch uniform. Those requirements carry cost, and cost is a hard barrier where the disease burden is greatest. For viral vectors and mRNA platforms, regulators will demand long-term safety data, batch release standards, and demonstrations of efficacy that go beyond neutralizing antibodies to real-world protection. Clinical trials are expensive, slow, and ethically complicated when the disease in question is geographically skewed toward low-income nations. Distribution raises another set of problems. In many of the places where rabies still kills, health systems are stretched thin, cold chains are imperfect, and clinics may lack the trained personnel to administer complex regimens. A vaccine that needs a single dose and is stable at ambient temperatures would transform the landscape. A monoclonal cocktail that costs the equivalent of a day's wages and can replace scarce plasma-derived immunoglobulin would too. But building that supply chain requires political will and investment on a scale that pharmaceutical companies do not undertake for small markets unless donors and multilateral agencies create demand guarantees or subsidize initial rollouts. There is also a scientific hurdle that separates prevention from cure, getting therapeutics into the brain. Rabies is neurotropic once it has taken up residence in neurons and travelled along nerves into the central nervous system. Delivering drugs at effective concentrations without causing collateral immune damage is fiendishly difficult. Small molecule antivirals that work in cell culture often fail in whole organisms because they cannot cross the blood-brain barrier in therapeutic concentrations. Gene therapies, adeno-associated vectors delivering genes that code for neutralizing antibodies or interfering RNAs, have shown tantalizing promise in animal models where localized expression within the brain can be engineered. But translating that to humans means confronting long-term expression, safety of the vectors, and the risk of inducing a damaging inflammatory response at the site of infection. In short, getting from bench success to bedside impact is a long, regulatory-laden journey. These scientific and logistical challenges are tied to ethical ones. Consider the sociology of resources. Intensive experimental care for a symptomatic case is expensive, and for the moment it is a conversation largely happening in high-income hospital wards. Conversely, the cheapest and most effective way to prevent human rabies, mass vaccination of domestic dogs, demands political and logistical work that looks remarkably like mundane public health. Door-to-door campaigns, cold chain logistics for conventional vaccines, community education to overcome mistrust, persistent funding for repeated annual campaigns. Vaccinating 70% of the dog population in a district is the threshold most epidemiologists cite as the point at which dog-mediated transmission falls away. It is the algebra of herd immunity applied to canine social life. Yet the spectacle of a high-tech ICU and an induced coma often attracts more headlines than the slow grind of community engagement that prevents exposure in the first place. That mismatch is not merely aesthetic, it reflects a misallocation of moral attention that leaves the most vulnerable unprotected. If you travel the world of rabies work today, there are instructive contrasts. Latin America in the late 20th and early 21st centuries transformed its burden through coordinated regional action led by PAHO and national ministries, with mass dog vaccination and improved access to human Countries that once reported hundreds of human rabies deaths now report almost none. The disease retreated. In parts of Europe, wildlife vaccination programs, the oral bait scattered across borders, turned sylvatic reservoirs into manageable problems. In Bangladesh, a national program that married mass dog vaccination with free or subsidized human PEP at district centres, backed by strong political commitment and international partnerships, produced dramatic declines in deaths within a few years. These are the policies that work. They are blunt, sometimes tedious, often expensive in the short term, but historically they alter the curve. At the same time, the persistence of rabies deaths in many parts of Africa and Asia is a story about inequality. Children who play among stray dogs, farmers who pick up a bat or nurse a wound on the back of a stray, families who cannot afford the travel to a clinic. These are the faces of failure in public health. Rabies is not a mysterious, intractable pathogen in the way Ebola sometimes appears to be. It is in many respects a failure of systems. Vaccines exist, immunoglobulins exist. We lack, in too many places, the social and administrative machinery to use them equitably. What then must be done if we are to consign rabies to history? The list is at once technical and ethical. Mass dog vaccination must be sustained and sailed to the coverage levels that interrupt transmission. Human post-exposure prophylaxis must be available at the point of need. Vaccine regimens that are dose-sparing and intradermal where appropriate can do more with less. Monoclonal antibody cocktails, if proven safe and effective across the spectrum of viral diversity, must be produced at scale and priced so that health systems in endemic countries can afford them. This will require tech transfer, pooled procurement, and donor support. Investment in next-generation vaccines, thermostable formulations, single-shot vectors, and mRNA platforms should be prioritised alongside investments in manufacturing capacity in low and middle-income regions so that pandemics of market failure do not perpetuate inequity. Surveillance systems must be strengthened so that exposures are counted, resources allocated rationally, and progress measured honestly. And above all, the One Health framework, bringing together human health, veterinary care, and environmental surveillance, must move from slogan to budget line and programmatic reality. There is, in this catalogue of necessary actions, a moral argument as plain as any epidemiological curve. Preventing exposure through dog vaccination and ensuring affordable access to PEP are not merely efficient, they are obligations of justice. The tiny, sometimes sensational story of a coma-induced survival is important, for it taught us about the immune correlates of protection and reoriented scientific imagination. But it does not obviate the fundamental truth that most lives will be saved not by heroic last-ditch intensive care, but by steady investment in prevention. If we are to be honest, the cheapest and most humane intervention will always be to stop the bite from happening. So we end, for now, on a sober sort of optimism. The history of rabies is a long ledger of fear and adaptation, from superstition and dog culls to Pasteur's experimental vaccine administered to Joseph Meister in 1885, from the bait scattered over European forests in the 80s and 1990s to the bench labs developing monoclonal cocktails and gene delivery systems today. Each epoch teaches a lesson. Pasteur taught us that a rational empirical approach could overturn dread. The wildlife vaccine programs taught us that targeting reservoirs can change fate lines for humans. The Milwaukee Protocol taught us humility and the need for rigorous evidence when desperation seeks hope. The present moment, armed with new biotech and with an increasingly clear political consensus about the feasibility of elimination, asks for one last lesson, that we will choose prevention over spectacle, equity over headline, sustained public good over singular rescue. There is no grand cinematic finale for rabies. No lightning bolt will strike a laboratory and make the disease vanish. The work ahead is patient, often boring and resolutely unromantic. It will involve vaccinating dogs in the heat of midday, keeping refrigerators humming in clinics on dirt roads, training nurses and paravets, committing budgets year after year. It will involve licensing new monoclonal cocktails and building factories in places that once imported every dose. It will involve watching data and sometimes changing course. It will require a moral clarity. Rabies deaths are preventable, therefore they are unjust. If the world takes that clarity seriously, if governments fund the steady machinery of control, if donors underwrite the first expensive steps to scale new technologies, and if communities are engaged as partners rather than passive recipients, then Pasteur's old experiment becomes less a single heroic act in a laboratory and more a steady global campaign that at last makes rabies an historical footnote. That is the quiet miracle worth our resources, not the flare of one human survival in an intensive care unit, but the long disappearance of a preventable scourge from the pages of human misfortune.